For those that aren't familiar with HiveBright, again, it's an online community engagement platform. And if that sounds very horizontal to you, trust your instincts. So you could use it for people collaborating on just about anything. And we had the customer base doing almost anything with it. And so, how are you going to pivot, like you said, from those early days of making the quarter, figuring it out, getting enough at bats to figure out what things are good for, just be able to step back and look at the patterns that are going on out in your customer base,
Mhm.
and determine where you're going to be focusing your effort, right? Um, so I mean, I guess just in the broader sense, maybe you could share a couple. How do you look at that? How do you look at what's going on in your customer base and how you deploy once you have the customer? How do you determine your priorities in not just targeting, but in customer support, in the product roadmap? Because you've got a very horizontal solution. You have a lot of priorities coming into you. What does HighBright do to digest all of that and make the right decisions?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's all about building the go-to-market machine, right? And ultimately driving towards what I would call as alignment across all the functions in the business. So once you've got a hypothesis that this is where you want to test the market, you think that you've got some repeatability there, uh, you got to set up the processes behind it. So it starts from even just what's your marketing message look like. How do you take those use cases and message it into problem statements in the market? How do you attract those buyers? How do you then tag them to those use cases so that you can then categorize and analyze that data? Of course, with AI these days, things have become a lot more easier, but even then, you need to build some metadata around that information that you're trying to generate, right, in your go-to-market machine. So you capture that demand, you start categorizing it, and then you start to track it. You set up your sales processes to then be able to engage with that buyer early on with messaging that resonates, value statements that resonate, success metrics for those. Every community defines success differently. So
Right.
how do you take a use case and associate certain types of KPIs to define success for that use case? Then you go and engage with your prospects to see if that type of value message resonates during the buying cycle. You then help them build a business case around those types of metrics. And then once you acquire that logo, and then you start the process of onboarding that customer, you want to reiterate whether those problem statements are really the ones they want to tackle early on in their journey. And then as they start the process of launching and going live, you got to set up the baseline for where they were prior to launching your product versus
Right.
after, and then start to capture data that can help you establish whether those the hypothesis that you had up front when you sold to
Yeah.
that customer is playing out the way that you expected it to. And believe me, so much changes as you're establishing your segmentation framework and your buyer personas and your value statements, and throw into it size of organization, the support the organization has. Sometimes even simple things like compliance requirements come in the way of being able to completely unleash the power of the product. So there are a lot of real life factors that play into it, not to mention the fact that the buyer, sometimes the executive buying your product, has a very different requirement from that program versus the administrator of your product, who's a day-to-day user,
Right.
versus the
Yep.
end user of the product. So the value could come from any one of these three dimensions. So you got to build out a pretty comprehensive picture to really know what's working and what's not working. But
Yeah.
if you start to do everything all at once across, say you have 20 use cases or more, you can get lost. So you pick one or two or three and prioritize, and then start to learn from those, and then start to expand that from there. So that process takes a couple years, I would say. But it pays out at the end, and you start to see, patterns emerge, and then you can start to build upon those patterns, so you can drive growth in specific areas faster than the others. And that kind of gets you to that point where you can start sustaining growth over there while you continue to experiment with the rest.